Hello everybody, it is Tom, and welcome to another video. You may notice that I am lower than usual, or you may not, I don't know. And that is because I am sitting in a different chair, which this is exactly the content that you signed up for to find out about what kind of chair I'm sitting in. But the reason is I did something to my back mysteriously overnight or over the course of the weekend, who knows. So I'm not sitting in my computer chair, I'm sitting in the comfortable chair that usually sits in the corner. And we also have our holiday setup, my mighty tree with its tangle of colored lights is also here. And yeah, so the reason we are gathered here today is to continue Comics versus Show, the series in which we look at the Heartstopper Comics and we look at the Heartstopper Show and we compare them. Wow. So last time we looked at episode 1, Out, and today we're going to look at episode 2, Family. In the first 3 episodes of season 2, we have a lot of the stuff from the comics kind of spread out. So once we get into the Paris episodes, this will be a lot more linear of just like following the comics. But for these few episodes, we're going to be kind of jumping around a little bit. So let's do it. All right. Yeah, let's do it. Okay. Yeah, I also did not get a lot of sleep last night because I was in pain. And then Darla woke me up twice, once just by jumping on me and once by bringing some manner of bug, I suspect a cockroach, into my bed in her mouth and being like, look what I have brought you. Which the thought was very much appreciated, but I'm usually not in the mood for a cockroach in my bed at any hour, but especially not at night when I'm trying to sleep. So for anyone who's looking for holiday gifts for me, bypass the cockroach in the bed. That would be my advice. Okay, so let's get on to the episode and the comics. Let's do it. Let's. Episode 2 of the show, which is called Family, starts out, we start off with parent-teacher conferences, also known as Peacher conferences. No one calls it that. So we start off with parent-teacher conferences, and we have this interesting thing that's not in the comics at all, where we're finding out that Charlie's grades have been slipping since he started dating Nick.
Charlie's always been a high achiever, but in the past few months, his grades have been slipping across most of his subjects. Been a bit distracted, haven't you?
We talked about this a lot in the actual episode reaction, so feel free to go check out that video if you want to hear more of my thoughts on that. But, okay, so Charlie's grades are slipping, and as a result, he is banned from seeing Nick.
Well, I think you and Nick need to spend some time apart.
That's not fair.
Until this coursework essay is handed in, Nick is not allowed round our house and you are not allowed round his.
Jane in the comics does do something like this later on, which we'll get to when we get to it. I suspect that it's going to be covered in season 3 because that's when it takes place chronologically. But there is a time when Jane is frustrated with Charlie being quote-unquote too focused on Nick and on their relationship, rather than like cleaning up the living room or things like that. So that's kind of the closest we get to that in the comics. So there's not really any analog to this in this part of the comics. But after Charlie is banned from seeing Nick, we have Nick and his mom going home after parent-teacher conferences, where, we found out that Nick is doing pretty well.
He's on track for solid grades in his GCSEs. As long as he keeps on focusing on his schoolwork, he'll be fine.
That's good, isn't it?
They go home to find Nick's brother David has returned home from uni.
Mom, make me one.
Not if you ask like that, David.
So in the comics, we had Nick and Charlie getting caught in the equipment room kissing by Ms. Singh. Nick goes home, so he rides the bus home with Charlie, says goodbye, and then he gets home, he says, hey, I'm home, and just hears Nicholas. There's David leaning against the banister to the stairs saying, all right, Nicky. And Sarah's like, Nick, your brother's home from uni. I think it's really interesting the look on Nick's face in the comics. So when Nick sees David in the show, he seems wary. He seems like he's kind of closing in on himself and putting up defenses. He doesn't want David to find out anything about the queer side of his life because he knows David's going to be a piece of crap about it.
What have you been up to since Christmas? Got a girlfriend yet?
Just please don't tell him about Charlie.
I won't, darling, don't worry.
But here, the look on Nick's face in the comics is almost like fear. Like, he genuinely looks afraid of David, which makes me wonder, like, what kind of things David did to him when they were younger. When someone's voice triggers this level of fear, you have to wonder, like, what happened between them. It wouldn't surprise me if David was, like, kind of sadistic as a brother, or, like, put Nick through a lot of bad situations when he was younger, and that's why this is Nick's knee-jerk reaction to David showing up. In the show, Nick tells Charlie about David over text because, Charlie has just texted him to say that he's been, essentially that Nick has been banned from coming over to his house and he's been banned from going over to Nick's. And so they have that whole conversation over text. But in the comics, we cut to the next morning, and they're informed, because again, in the comics, we don't have the plot of Nick and Ben ending up paired together to sit next to each other for exam prep. So Nick comes to form just like usual, and sits down looking like a zombie, and Charlie's like, "Nick, are you okay?" And Nick looks over at him like with all the tiredness of the ages in his eyes and just says, "Late night." And Charlie's like, "How come?" And Nick leans his head on Charlie. And this moment, of course, is very similar to what we see in the show in season 1, episode 7. Anyway, so Nick leans his head on Charlie's shoulder and says, "Meh, my brother's home and he's being shitty. I don't really want to talk about it." In the show, we have him saying, like, something like, "My brother's home, he's a dick," which, concise, accurate, good. But yeah, here he's like, "I don't really want to talk about it." And so Charlie says, "Well, I had something I wanted to ask you." And then he says, "We've got the meeting about the Paris trip tonight. Well, Tao, Aled, and Elle are going to be there." And then he whispers, "And we could tell them about us if you want." And in the picture with Nick with his head on Charlie's shoulder where we pull back, you can see, like, most of the people sitting near them are staring at them. And this is another case of, like, how clear it is that Nick is not really thinking much about what people might be thinking about them, if that makes sense. So, like, if we compare this to Ben's behavior in the show, he was afraid to even talk to Charlie in the hallway, or for anyone to even suspect that they knew each other, because he was afraid that that would lead people to realize that they were in some sort of twisted relationship together. But with Nick, like, he's full on, like, he's essentially hugging Charlie in the middle of class. Like, he has his head on Charlie's shoulder. He's got his arms wrapped around him. They're staying like that, having a quiet conversation for quite some time. And at no point does he pull back, does he worry, like, "Oh, what if people see?" And they're full on staring, and he's just not even thinking about it. So I think that says a lot about where he is mentally regarding coming out to the rest of the school at this point. So then Charlie whispers, "And we could tell them about us if you want." And Nick's like, yeah, that sounds good. Are you sure you want to?" And Charlie says, "Yeah, I mean, it's just my friends. They'll be cool about it." And then after all this, they glance around, and everyone who's been staring at them, like, quickly snaps their heads back, like they weren't watching at all. And then Nick, of course, in this moment is remembering what Charlie had said in the equipment room about how being out as a couple would be too much for him, like, too stressful for him. And so he says, "About what you said yesterday, though." And Charlie says, "Don't worry about it." And then Mr. Lang comes in like, "Okay, Hamlet 5, settle down." And Nick is still looking concerned over at Charlie, and Charlie still looks a bit stressed or upset. So this is another hint we have here of the fact that Nick's coming out, or their coming out as a couple, is kind of a stressful situation for Charlie, because the last time the school as a whole found out something related to him, it ended in lots of bullying and a really bad experience for him. So I think it makes a lot of sense that he's pretty nervous here. In the show, then, we skip to the next morning where we have the Ben and Imogen plot, where Nick walks up and Ben spots him and immediately starts like cuddling up to Imogen and kissing her and stuff like that. And then we jump to Charlie visiting Nick during exam prep. So there's so much happening in the show that does not have anything, like any correlation to what's going on in the comics. There's a lot of extra stuff in the episode, which I love all this extra stuff because, you know, these plots are very interesting. We have Ben being a dick and Nick calling him out and Mr. Farouk putting them in a room alone together because that's what you do with two people who won't stop talking to each other.
It's not my fault he liked me before you. I hate you because you literally assaulted him.
Then we jump to Nick in his bedroom going over his notes, and David comes in and we get a little glimpse of the dickishness that is David.
Can you get out? I'm trying to study.
Charlie, who's Charlie?
Give that back. Can you
Is
give
Charlie
it back?
your girlfriend?
No, stop it.
Yeah.
David!
Fine.
Seriously.
So boring.
So in the comics, we jump to the Paris trip meeting, which has a lot more happening in it than we see in the show, because there's the whole thing of Charlie telling Aled and then deciding not to tell Tao and that whole thing. And then after that, we jump to Nick on Monday after school, lying in bed with Nellie and his computer and his phone, when the doorbell rings and he jumps up and it's Charlie at the door, and Charlie says, "Hey," and Nick's like, "Hey, are you and Charlie just whoomp, just like falls right onto him, of course mirroring what we saw of them earlier with Nick with his head on Charlie's shoulder. And Charlie says, "School sucks without you." So I guess this is kind of similar to, in the show, Nick is separated from Charlie because he and the other year 11s are in the gym studying for their exams. But in the comics, the year 11s are allowed to not be at school, which, I mean, I would definitely prefer that to myself. But yeah, so Nick does not have to be at school, and so Charlie's stuck there all by himself. So that is similar. But yeah, so Charlie says, "School sucks without you." And Nick's like, "I'd say I'm sad, but honestly, not being at school is great." Charlie's like, "I hate you." But Nick picks him up and lifts him and swings him into the house and says, "Come on, let's go do nothing." So the parallel between this and the show is, of course, the scene where Charlie comes over to Nick's house. But what precedes this and the moods of Nick and Charlie are a bit different. So in the comics, we have Nick has just had a relaxing day at home. Charlie's feeling kind of sad and meh and like not great because he's had to get through a day without Nick at school. But in the show, what has just happened is that Nick has confronted Imogen about Ben.
Why are you dating Ben?
What do you mean?
He's a dick. He's done some really bad stuff.
What did he do?
I can't tell you.
And has not been able to tell her why he's a dick, just that he is. And Imogen took this very badly.
I've known him since primary school. He's basically one of my oldest friends.
Yeah, but...
And you know what? I don't actually have that many friends. But Ben is one of the few people who actually likes me. So whatever happened in the past, he's nicer now.
Imogen...
Good luck in the exam.
And this leads us straight into the scene of Nick doing his maths exam and having what's essentially an anxiety attack while he's taking it, and as such doing very badly on it. So we're coming off of Nick having a bad moment with Imogen and a really bad test, and Charlie defies his grounding, and he shows up at Nick's house saying that he's there to cheer Nick up after his terrible exam.
You snuck out again.
I'm here to cheer you up after your terrible exam.
Nick looks so thrilled. He looks so happy that Charlie's come over. Before this happens, we also have Nick and Charlie at the park, which is one of my favorite scenes in the whole season, and a lot of other people's as well, because it's just a beautiful scene. The closest we have to that is one panel in the comics, which we actually looked at last time, where we just see Nick and Charlie studying at the park with Nellie. I'm really glad they expanded that into the beautiful scene that it was, because A++, beautiful scene.
Charlie!
So then we have Nick and Charlie at Nick's house. Nick is sitting in his beanbag with his computer, and Charlie's laying on the bedroom floor with Nellie. And Nellie is being adorable, and Charlie's being adorable. And Nick is looking at them just lovingly, especially at Charlie, but, you know, he loves Nellie too. So then Charlie sits in the beanbag with Nick and leans his head on Nick's shoulder. So at this point, Nick says, "Hey Char, are you annoyed at Tao?" Because, and we'll talk about this when we get to it in the next episode, but Charlie, during the Paris trip meeting, finds out from Aled that Tao is the one who accidentally outed him the previous year. And, you know, I really like how they do this in the show, where Tao is the one to tell Charlie, and Charlie immediately is like, well, that wasn't your fault. Like, I love what that says about their friendship. I love what it informs about Tao's character. But in the comics, it's Aled who tells Charlie, and that then makes Charlie concerned about telling Tao about his relationship with Nick. So Nick is asking Charlie about Tao, and this leads Charlie into the conversation that he and Nick have at the end of episode 8. Charlie doesn't need any coaxing. Nick doesn't have to draw it out of him. He's not hiding anything from Nick. He just tells him everything that was going on with the bullying and talks about his periods of self-harm, and they have a very similar conversation to the one that they do in episode 8, except I think it's a little less charged because we haven't been building up to it for so long. We haven't had all these clues dropped about how deeply the bullying affected Charlie. So I do really think that that scene is so well executed in the show. And I love it in the comics, but I do love the placement of it in the show and the way that it's acted and all that. So after they have this very deep conversation, Charlie falls asleep with Nick, and they're watching Iron Man, which clearly Nick loves quite a lot because he has an Iron Man poster behind him. So Nick notices that Charlie is asleep, and then Charlie wakes up, and Nick's like, "Hey, are you tired, or is the movie just really boring?" And Charlie stretches and is like, "Haha, just tired, haven't been sleeping well because of exams." And I'm sure that's part of it, but we have discussed before that probably another aspect of it is the fact that when you're not eating enough, you tend to get tired more often and fall asleep more easily. So that's probably also something that's going on here. And Nick says, "Well, my shoulder is available for naps anytime." And then asks him, "Hey, do you want something to eat?" Charlie says, "Oh, nah, I'm fine." And Nick says, "You sure? You haven't eaten since lunch, right?" And Charlie's like, "I'm fine. I'm not much of a snacker." And then he says, "I'll have a cup of tea, though." And Nick says, "Haha, you're such an old man." And Charlie says, "Hey." And yeah, so in the show, this is pretty similar. Nick notices that Charlie is asleep and smiles at him similarly as he does in the comics. And Charlie kind of wakes up and looks up at Nick and is like, "Oh, did I fall asleep?"
Did I fall asleep? Are you tired? Or is this movie just really boring? I did warn you I'm not a fan of Marvel movies.
And Charlie says, "I did warn you I'm not a fan of Marvel movies." Which I do wonder if they put in there just specifically because Joe was cast in a Marvel property. Though it is canon even in the comics that Charlie is not a big fan of Marvel. So Nick shuts the laptop down and asks Charlie if he wants something to eat.
Do you want something to eat? Can make us some dinner.
No, I'll have something when I get home.
And Charlie says, "I'll have something when I get home," which is a little different from what he says in the comics. In the comics, he's just like, "No, I'm fine. I'm not much of a snacker." So I do like the way that they set this up here in the show, where Charlie says, "I'll have something when I get home," and then of course when he gets home, he says, "I ate at Nick's." So this is another one of the clues interspersed about Charlie's eating disorder.
I'd have a cup of tea, though.
You're such an old man.
Hey!
And Charlie is left to inform Nellie of her cuteness and pet her because she desperately needs pets. We follow Nick downstairs. In the show, we're with Charlie when the door opens and David steps in.
Hi.
Hi.
What was your name? Sorry.
David asks Charlie what his name is, even though he's already pretty sure and has already seen the pictures on Nick's wall of Nick and Charlie, so he already knows, but he's just kind of making absolutely sure. And this being a follow-up to earlier, where David saw Charlie's name on Nick's phone and thought Charlie was Nick's girlfriend. So, in the comics, though, we see Nick buttering some toast and making tea, and then as he's on his way back upstairs, he hears voices. He hears David say, "Nice, and where did you meet?" And Charlie says, "Oh, we're in the same form." And again, look at Nick's face in the comics. He looks scared. Like, it's so interesting to me how just terrified Nick looks of David. And I mean, like, in the show as well, he obviously doesn't look pleased at the idea that David is talking to Charlie. He does look very worried and concerned and wary, but he doesn't have quite that level of fear that we see in the comics.
And where did you two meet?
We're in the same form at school.
In the comics, we have Nick walking in saying, "David," and David says, "Oh, there he is."
David.
There he is. I was just getting acquainted with Charlie.
He says, "Jesus, don't shit yourself. I'm just making friends with Charlie." And Charlie's there with Nellie. Nellie's being a good protector dog. And Nick says, "Yeah, well, we're busy. Fuck off."
Yeah, well, we're busy, so you can go away now.
So David's like, all right, keep your tits on. And so in both situations, Nick checks with Charlie to make sure he's okay.
You okay?
Yeah.
And David turns to leave and says, "I just wanted to meet the guy who turned my little brother gay."
I just wanted to meet the guy that, turned my little brother gay.
Nick turns around, looking really, really worried and scared, and says, "What?" And David in the comics outright lies and says, "Mom told me. Should have always known you'd turn out to be gay."
What?
I mean, I should have always known you'd turn out to be gay, really.
And Nick does his stance and says, "I'm bi, actually. And so what?"
I'm bi, actually. And so what?
David, being a shit, is like, "I'm bi, actually. If you're gonna be gay, at least admit you're gay." And Nick follows him out the door saying, "This is why I didn't want to tell you."
I'm bi, actually. So, look, if you're going to be gay, at least admit you're gay.
This is exactly why I didn't want to tell you.
Too late now.
And David's like, "Haha, too late now." We followed them down the stairs, Charlie and Nellie following along. And David says, "What, I'm not allowed to be skeptical when you're randomly deciding you're gay?" And Nick says, "No, you're not. God, I knew you'd react like this." And David says, "Like what?" He looks really amused. And Nick says, "Like a homophobic piece of shit."
What?
God, I knew you would be like this.
Like what?
Like a homophobic prick.
Guys, what is going on?
We have Sarah in the background with a question mark. And she comes out saying, "Language boys, what is going on?" And Nick says, "Mom, why did you tell him about Charlie?" And Sarah says, "Darling, I didn't. I'd never. It's up to you if and when you want to tell people, including David and your dad."
Why did you tell him about Charlie?
I didn't, darling.
Mum didn't tell me. You left a picture of you two kissing on your bedroom wall.
Why do you keep going in my room?
And Nick is like, "What?" And David, looking very amused, says, "Okay, fine. I found out on my own. Not my fault you leave photos of you kissing lying around in your room." And we have Nick flashing back to the picture of him and Charlie kissing. And David says, "I mean, come on, Mom. He's saying he's bi. What a load of absolute bullshit." And Sarah says, "David."
Come on, Mum. He's saying he's bi. I mean, what a load of absolute bullshit.
David, please don't swear.
So, in the comics, when David says, "Come on, Mom, he's saying he's bi. What a load of absolute bullshit," Sarah says, "David." Whereas in the show, she says, "David, please don't swear," which I think is a really interesting choice because it shows that even though Sarah is so supportive, she still is not able to shut down David in this moment for his biphobia. Instead, she yells at him for his swearing. And when they go into the kitchen, she's yelling at him for going to Nick's room, not for all his homophobia and biphobia and stuff like that.
He can't even admit he's gay.
And David says, he can't even admit he's gay. And Nick yells, "I hate you." And David says, "Oh, fuck off." And Sarah says, "Boys, that is enough."
He's such a dick.
I'm just being realistic.
Right, boys, that is enough. David, in the kitchen now.
And then we have Charlie quietly staying in the background. "Nick, should I go home?" And Nick looks back at him and says, maybe that's a good idea. I'm so sorry. I don't want him to start picking on you too."
Should I go home?
Right there on his wall where anyone can see it.
You've got no right to go.
And we have David and Sarah in the kitchen arguing. Sarah saying, "David, you had no right to search through Nick's stuff." And David saying, "He was just lying there on his bookshelf. It's not my fault." And it's interesting that, like, In the show, it's on the wall. Like, the photos are on the wall, and anyone could walk in and see them, so it's not very surprising that David sees them when he comes in. But here in the comics, they are lying on the bookshelf. So David is clearly snooping around a bit more in this situation. So then Nick says, "I'm sorry." And Charlie says, "Nick, it's fine. Will you be okay?" And Nick looks at him, and Charlie looks at him, and they kiss. And then we have Nick at the door, and Sarah is saying, "You're being selfish, David." And David is saying, "He's selfish for not telling me." Ooh, that's a whole other can of worms right there. Nick says, "I'm so sorry. I'll text you in a bit, okay?" And Charlie says, yeah, it's fine." And the door shuts, and Charlie, sad, turns away.
I'm sorry. I'll text you later, okay?
Yeah. It's fine.
Sorry.
In the show, they don't have that comforting kiss that they share in the comics. There's more of a distance between them. And I think it really makes sense because Nick is very upset and Charlie is very upset. And, like, this is not a moment when I think they would be drawn to kiss, especially when David is right there being a homophobic piece of shit. Even if he's in the kitchen with Sarah, it's just not the right moment. So I think they made the right choice in removing that part for the show. It also does a lot to show how distant Charlie feels and how guilty he feels in this moment, that, like, there's no hug, there's no kiss. Nick just apologizes and closes the door and goes to deal with what's going on. So then in the show, after this, we go to Charlie getting home and getting in trouble with his parents because he's broken the ban on going over to Nick's house.
Where have you been? Nick's, I assume.
He was worried about his exams. I just wanted to...
Yeah, I don't want to hear it. You are grounded for the rest of this term.
And his dad asks him if he wants some dinner, and he's like, "No, I ate at Nick's."
You want some dinner?
No. I ate at Nick's.
Jumping back over to the comics, let me know if this is too chaotic, jumping back and forth. We have Charlie lying in bed, and he's texting Nick to say, "Why is being out so complicated? In books and films, there's just one big coming out scene, and then everyone is fine, haha. Real life isn't like that, I guess." And then tap, tap, tap. "Are you awake?"
I wouldn't like me if I met me.
And meanwhile, in the Nelson household, there's still a lot of yelling going on. Nick is yelling, "Just fuck off and leave me alone." And David, all smiling still, is like, "No need to have a tantrum." And Sarah yells, "Boys, no shouting." Like, that's not the problem here. So then Nick is coming out of the shower, rubbing his hair dry. And this is very similar to how it goes in the show, where we have Nick coming out of the shower, toweling off his hair, whumps onto his bed, and picks up his phone and is like, "Shit, sorry, I meant to message you. My brother's being a dick. He literally won't stop pestering me. Might be better if you don't come around here until he's back at uni." And then he says, "It was my fault for not telling him sooner, to be honest." So Charlie says, "I'm sorry, this is all my fault for coming over." Whereas in the comics, Charlie says, "No, you shouldn't have to tell him if you..." You know what? Let's look at the whole conversation before I start comparing them. Okay. So in the comics, Nick says, "It was my fault for not telling him sooner, to be honest." Charlie says, "No, you shouldn't have to tell him if you didn't want to." Nick says, "I guess he would have found out eventually one way or another. I should probably call my dad soon and tell him too." And Charlie says, "You don't have to. You can take your time." And Nick says, "I want him to know about you. Plus, I want to be the one to tell him, not David." And Charlie has sad faces. And then Charlie says, "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. You shouldn't have to feel rushed or pressured by anybody." And Nick says, "Charlie, this is not your fault. Coming out is hard and complicated, right? And it doesn't all happen at once. And it doesn't always go right. Sometimes it probably doesn't even happen at all." Lots of exclamation points going on here. "Coming out to my mom was amazing, but I never expected it to go super well with everyone. And it's not your fault. I just want people to know who I am and know that you're my boyfriend. And I know that not everyone will like it, but I'm ready for that. We're probably going to have to come out hundreds of more times in our lives. It might be shitty sometimes, but I promise I'm okay. And it's all worth it."
It's all worth it to be with you.
And so we have Charlie sniffing, a few tears falling with the dots, and this is the point where he types, "I love you," and is about to send it, and is waiting and stressing while Nick is having a lovely moment with Nellie, and then he deletes it and says, "I wish we could just nap and watch movies all the time and nobody bothered us." And Nick says, "That's the dream." And that's where that scene ends in the comics. In the show, we have Charlie asking, why is coming out so complicated? Are you awake? And then Nick says, hey, sorry about today. I should have told him sooner, to be honest. So we cut a lot of the conversation that's in the comics, which I think is fine. They get the main points, the most important points here. And Charlie says, I'm sorry, this is all my fault for coming over. And then he says, I should have stood up for you against your brother. So this line is not in the comics. And I think it's especially important to have it here in the show because we have the narrative going through this season of Charlie being determined to protect Nick from all the negative aspects of coming out. And so this is just another part of that where Charlie feels like he's failed because he was not able to protect Nick from his homophobic brother. So again, Charlie taking a lot more guilt onto himself. And Nick kind of frowns a little bit and shakes his head. And Charlie's there just wallowing in his feelings of guilt. And Nick sends him a voice message, which I think is, number one, great for the show format because, of course, it's going to be more emotional and hard-hitting if we hear his voice. And number two, just good in general because in this moment, Charlie needs to hear from Nick. And, text is ambiguous and not as personal. And here we have Nick's voice coming to tell him something similar, but not exactly the same as what he says in the comics.
Charlie, this is not your fault. I don't care what David thinks anyway. I mean, it was never going to go perfectly with everyone. Coming out to my mum was amazing, but there are still awful people in the world, like my brother, but I can handle it. I promise.
Charlie responds to that with 3 hearts. He's not able to reply in words. This scene obviously is a lot angstier here in the show because Charlie is just really consumed by his feelings of guilt, and the fact that Nick's message, while comforting, is nonetheless telling him what he did not want to hear, which is the truth, that he can't protect Nick from this. And there's no way it's going to be perfect. There's no way that coming out is going to be without any kind of issues. And while Nick has been very lucky so far with the way that Imogen reacted, the way his mom reacted, it's not going to be like that always and with everyone. So, in the show, we see Charlie put the phone away and curl up under his blanket and kind of curl into a little ball. And that's how we end. Whereas in the comics, it's a bit more, you feel more like both Nick and Charlie have been comforted in this moment. But of course, we know that the show hits harder on some of the darker moments and the angstier moments because, number one, it's a show and it needs to do that. And number two, I just think it does a really good job of exploring the depths of what Charlie is going through and what Nick is going through. And it does a really good job with that. I might have just said it does a really good job twice, so that's all right. So then in the comics right after this, we have a few short scenes of some time passing and Charlie talking to Aled, and then we go right into the Paris trip. So, episode 3 is going to be an interesting one. I'm not sure if it's going to be like a 5-minute video because there's not really very much. There's not really very much in there that correlates to the comics, but there is some. So we'll look at that. But for now, that's it. That's all that we have from episode 2 that is reflected in the comics. So yeah, as always, I think that the mood of the comics is a little lighter, which makes sense. First of all, because of the medium of the comics and just what kind of story it was meant to be. And second of all, because of the fact that we're not delving quite as deeply into the serious topics that are going on and, the feelings Charlie is dealing with and all that. We're also missing scenes like Elle going to Lambert for the open house and Tal's whole thing, talking to his mom and deciding to tell Elle his feelings, because at this point in the comics, we've just had one scene with Elle and Tao where we have, we'll talk about this next time because it happens at the Paris meeting. So we've only had one scene with Elle and Tao where we find out that Charlie thinks they kind of like each other, but neither of them are willing to say it. And that's it. Okay, so what are your favorite moments from the show or the comics in this section? For me, I love the scene of them in the park, and I like the changes that they've made in the show. There's no change that they made in the show for this episode where I was like, well, why did they do that? Or I wouldn't have done that. I think that they've built a very cohesive narrative throughout the show, building off of what is in the comics and taking it to the next level. So it's a lot deeper, it's a lot more emotional, we get a lot more. Not just in terms of characters, but in terms of how deeply we're exploring things. And I really think it was the right choice to move the scene of Charlie confiding in Nick about the bullying and self-harm, to move that to episode 8, and to turn it into the scene that everything was building to. The way that they structured that was just perfect. I love the way that they did that. And the fact that Charlie is not just completely open about it. He needs to be in a very safe place, and to have Nick kind of help him be able to talk about it. I think that really makes sense for Charlie's character, so I love that they did that. But we'll talk about that more in episode 8. Okay? Alright, so that's... Oh my god. So that's gonna do it for this episode of Comics vs. Show. But yeah, tell me about your favorite moments in this episode, and do you think that the way that I'm structuring this is working? Because I'm still kind of trying to figure out, like, because for season 1 it was easy because we hadn't looked at the comics at all yet, so all I did was just go through the comics and then show the scene from the show. But here I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between them, so I hope that it's not too chaotic / hard to follow. Let me know if it is. But yeah, I'm figuring it out as we go, so hopefully it's okay. But, okay, so let me know what you like in the comics or the show or both in this section, and what changes you thought were interesting or what changes you liked or didn't like. And yeah, okay, well, thank you so much for watching and liking and commenting and subscribing. And if you've purchased my book, Guardians, thank you for doing that. And if you've left a review or a rating or both on Amazon or Goodreads, thank you times a million. I really, 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 really appreciate that. It means a lot to me, so much. And as always, a huge thanks to our patrons, who are just completely amazing and the best humans. And a special shout out to our Nick Nelson members, Kelly Walker, Paul Z, Kent Smither, Kim Engel, and Lauren Javier. And Lauren, if I'm saying your name wrong, please let me know, because there's a very good chance that I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Alright, well that's going to do it for now. That's going to do it for today. Hopefully the next time I speak to you, I will be back in my regular chair and not in pain. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I hope you guys are having a wonderful December so far, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, bye.